Hey y'all, it's Josh. So, in the last video, we read about how Elwë met Melion. So essentially, the story of boy meets girl, boy and girl are enchanted for a long-ass time, boy and girl becomes king and queen of a mighty kingdom. Essentially, that's what the last chapter was. So yeah. Anyways, Chapter 5 of Eldamar and the Princes of the Eldalier. Eldalier is, as previously stated, the name, another name for the Eldar, or the Elves. In time, the hosts of the Vanyar and the Noldor came to the last western shores of the Hitherlands. In the north, these shores, in the ancient days after the battles of the power... let me reread that. In the north, these shores, in the ancient days after the Battle of the Powers, bent ever westward, until in the northernmost parts of Arda, only a narrow sea divided Aman, upon which Valinor was built from the Hitherlands. But this narrow sea was filled with grinding ice because of the violence of the frosts of Melkor. Therefore, Orome did not lead the host of the Eldalier into the far north, but brought them to the fair lands about the river Sirion, that afterwards were named Beleriand. And from those shores whence first the Eldar looked in fear and wonder on the sea, there stretched an ocean, wide and dark and deep, between them and the mountains of Aman. Now, here we get a little description of the Vanyar and the Noldor being like, okay, we want to get to Valinor, yes, but at the same time, oh my god, look at the sea, it's terrifying, what are we gonna do, how are we gonna get there? Hold your horses there, Vanyar and Noldor. Ulmo's got you covered. Now Ulmo, by the counsel of the Valar, came to the shores of Middle-earth and spoke with the Eldar who waited there, gazing on the dark waves. And because of his words and the music which he made for them on his horn of shell, their fear of the sea was turned rather to desire. Therefore, Ulmo uprooted an island which long had stood alone amid the sea, far from either shore since the tumults of the fall of Iluin, and with the aid of his servants he moved it as it were a mighty ship, and anchored it in the bay of Balar, into which Sirion poured his waters. Then the Vanyar and the Noldor embarked upon that isle, and were drawn over the sea, and came at last to the long shores beneath the mountains of Aman. And they entered Valinor, and were welcomed into its bliss. But the eastern horn of the island, which was deep grounded in the shoals off the mouth of Sirion, were broken asunder, and remained behind. And that, it is said, became the Isle of Valar, to which afterwards Ose often came. But, as always, the Teleri remained still in Middle-earth, for they dwelt in East Beleriand, far from the sea, and they heard not the summons of Ulmo until too late. And many searched still for Elwë their lord, and without him they were unwilling to depart. But when they learned that Ingwe and Finwë and their peoples were gone, then many of the Teleri passed on to the shores of Beleriand, and dwelt there after near the mouths of Sirion, in longing for their friends that had departed. And they took Olwe, Elwë's brother, to be their king, Long they remained by the coasts of the western sea, and Ocean Uinen, his wife, came to them and befriended them. And Ose instructed them, sitting upon a rock near the margin of the land, and of him they learned all manner of sea lore and sea music. Thus it came to be that the Teleri, who were from the beginning lovers of water and the fairest singers of all the elves, were after enamored of the sea, and their songs were filled with the sound of waves upon the shore. When many years had passed, Ulmo hearkened to the prayers of the Noldor and of Finwë their king, who grieved at their long sundering from the Teleri, and besought him to bring them to Aman, if they would come. And most of them proved now willing indeed, but great was the chief. Let me retry that. But great was the grief of. Okay. God damn it. Hold on. But great was the grief of Ose when Ulmo returned to the coasts of Beleriand to bear them away to Valinor. For his care was for the seas of Middle-earth and the shores of the Hitherlands, and he was ill-pleased that the voices of the Teleri should be heard no more in his domain. Some he persuaded to remain, and those were the Falathrim, another subgroup of the Sindar. The elves of the Falas, who in after days had dwellings at the havens of Brithambar and Eglarist, the first mariners of Middle-earth and the first makers of ships. Giordan, the shipwright, was their lord. Now, interesting fact, Giordan in Sindarin means shipwright. So whenever you hear me say Giordan, or you see Giordan, like in writing, you're basically hearing or seeing shipwright, the shipwright. Fun little Easter egg. Okay, where were we? Okay. The kinsfolk and friends of Elwë Singolo also remained in the Hitherlands, seeking him yet, though they would fain have departed to Valinor and the light of the trees, if Ulmo and Olwe had been willing to tarry longer. But Olwe would be gone, and at last the main host of the Teleri embarked upon the isle, and Ulmo drew them far away. Then the friends of Elwë were left behind, and they called themselves Eglath, the Forsaken People. They dwelt in the woods and hills of Beleriand rather than by the sea, which filled them with sorrow. But the desire of Aman was ever in their hearts. But when Elwë awoke from his long trance, he came forth from Nan Elmoth with Melion, and they dwelt thereafter in the woods, in the midst of the land. Greatly, though, he had desired to see again the light of the trees in the face of. Greatly, though he had desired to see the light of Aman. Hold on. Greatly, though he desired to see again the light of the trees, in the face of Melion he beheld the light of Aman, as in an unclouded mirror, and in that light he was content. His people gathered about him with joy, and they were amazed, for fair and noble as he had been, now he appeared as it were, a lord of the Maiar. His hair was grey-silver, tallest of all the children of Iluvatar, and a high doom was before him. Now, doom, in this context, is not the same as, you know, a punishments. Like, say, if a person were to rob a bank, they get arrested, they get sent to jail, they have to go to court, then they get a sentence. That's one type of doom. Doom in this context is more like fate, if it were, as it were. Now Osei followed after the host of Olwe, and when they were come to the Bay of Eldamar, which is Elvenholm, he called to them, and they knew his voice and begged Ulmo to stay their voyage. And Ulmo granted their request, and at his bidding, Osei made fast the island and rooted it to the foundations of the sea. Ulmo did this more readily, for he understood the hearts of the Teleri, and in the council of the Valar he had spoken against the summons, thinking that it would be were better for the Quendi to remain in Middle-earth. Now here we get a little funny tidbit. The Valar were little pleased to learn what he had done, and Finwë grieved when the Teleri came not, and yet more when he learned that Elwë was forsaken and knew that he should not see him again, unless it were in the halls of Mandos. So, the Valar were essentially like, why'd you do that, Ulmo? Ulmo's like, to spite you bitches, that's why. Well, not really to spite them, but like, in a way to kind of spite them, because the Valar was like, we need to bring the elves to Valinor. And some of the Valar who, you know, Ulmo was like the leader in like not bringing them to Valinor, was like, just let them be where they are, dudes. Like, why you gotta bring them over here? We're essentially kidnapping them. That's essentially what Melkor is telling the elves back at Quevian, and we're kidnapping them from their own homes. Let them be where they want to be. But the island was not moved again, and stood there alone in the Bay of Eldamar. And it was called Tol Eressëa, the Lonely Isle. Now, Tol Eressëa, as it were, used to be a part of Beleriand, but it was broken off, and the island was sent over the sea and placed in the Bay of Eldamar. So that is the last actual remaining place besides Lindon and Forlindon, Forlindon and Harlindon, and the Blue Mountains that remain of, well, actually, there's Tol Morwen, which that will come up in a later video. Then there's the Isle of Himring, which will also come up in a later video. And then there it was, I believe it was Tar Fuin, that will come up in a later video. When they come up, I will make sure to do my research so that I don't give you any misinformation. But besides those three places, those three islands, the Blue Mountains, Foran Harlindon, and Tol Eressëa, well, besides the places that I mentioned before, Tol Eressëa, Tol Eressëa is like one final tiny bit of Beleriand, because, spoiler alerts, I don't like doing them, but Beleriand's gonna fall under the sea. There the Teleri abode as they wished under the stars of heaven, and yet within sight of Aman and the deathless shore. And by that long sojourn apart in the lonely isle was caused the sundering of their speech from that of the Vanyar and the Noldor. To these, the Valar had given a land and a dwelling place. Even among the radiant flowers of the tree-lit gardens of Valinor, they longed still at times to see the stars, and therefore a gap was made in the great walls of the Pelori, and there in a deep valley that ran down to the sea the Eldar raised a high green hill, Tuna. Not not the food that a lot of people eat that I can't personally stand because they not my thing. But Tuna is the hill, and that is what it was called. From the west, the light of the trees fell upon it, and its shadow lay ever eastward. And to the east, it looked towards the Bay of Elvenholm, and the Lonely Isle, and the shadowy seas. Then the Calakiria, the passive light, the radiance of the Blessed Realm, streamed forth, kindling the dark waves to silver and gold, and it touched the Lonely Isle, and its western shore grew green and fair. There bloomed the first flowers that ever were east of the mountains of Aman. Upon the crown of Tuna, the city of the elves was built, the white walls and terraces of Tirion, and the highest of the towers of that city was the Tower of Ingwe, Mindon Eldalieva, whose silver lamp shone far out into the mists of the sea. Few are the ships of mortal men that have seen its slender beam. In Tirion upon Tuna, the Vanyar and the Noldor dwelt long in fellowship. And since of all things in Valinor they loved most the white tree, Yavanna made for them a tree like to a lesser image of Telperion, save that it did not give light of its own being. Galathilion it was named in the Sindarin tongue. This tree was planted in the courts beneath the Mindon, and there flourished, and its seedlings were many in Eldamar. Of these, one was afterwards planted in Tol Eressëa, and it prospered there, and was named Celeborn. Thence came in the fullness of time, as is elsewhere told, Nimloth, the white tree of Numenor. So here we get the first mention of Numenor before it's actually made at the beginning of the Second Age. Cool. Manwë and Varda loved most the Vanyar, the fair elves, but the Noldor were beloved by Aule, and he and his people came often among them. Great became their knowledge and their skill, yet even greater was their thirst for more knowledge, and in many things they soon surpassed their teachers. They were changeful in speech, for they had great love of words, and sought ever to find names more fit for all things that they knew or imagined. And it came to pass that the masons of the house of Finwë, quarrying in the hills after stone, for they delight in the building of high towers, first discovered the earth gems, and brought them forth in countless myriads. And they devised tools for the cutting and the shaping of gems, and carved them in many forms. They hoarded them not, but gave them freely, and by their labor enriched all Valinor. Let me see. Okay. The Noldor afterwards came back to Middle-earth, and this tale tells mostly of their deeds. Therefore, the names and kinship of their princes may here be told, in that form which these names later bore in the tongues of the elves of Beleriand. Finwë was king of the Noldor. His sons, the sons of Finwë are Feanor, who gets his own chapter in the next video, and Fingolfin, and Finarfin. But the mother of Feanor was Miriel Sirende, whereas the mother of Fingolfin and Finarfin was Indis of the Vanyar. Keep that little fact in mind. It'll be explained in the next video. Or maybe even in this video, depending on what goes on here. Anyways, Feanor was the mightiest in skill of word and of hand, more learned than his brothers. His spirit burned as a flame. Fingolfin was the strongest, the most steadfast, and the most valiant. Finarfin was the fairest and the most wise of hearts, and afterwards he was a friend of the sons of Olwe, lord of the Teleri, and had to wife Earwyn, the swan maiden of Alqualonde, Olwe's daughter. The 7 sons of Feanor were Maithros the Tall, Maglor the mighty singer, whose voice was heard far over land and sea, Celagorm the Fair. Be very wary of these sons of Feanor, by the way. Anyways, Celagorm the Fair, and Caranthir the Dark, Curufin the Crafty, who inherited most of his father's skills of hand, and the youngest, Amrod and Amras, who were twin brothers, alike in mood and